Hi, I'm Michael Paddock, CEO of Grants Office. The landscape of grant funding for law enforcement agencies is primarily composed of three basic sources: federal funding, state funding, and foundation funding. Federal funding is by far the largest source of funding in the country across the board, not just for law enforcement. It covers everything from agriculture to education to transportation to water and wastewater projects, but it also supports law enforcement initiatives and homeland security initiatives, primarily through the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security. But there may be also other opportunities from the Department of Transportation, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Education, that may be relevant for law enforcement as well. There are 26 federal grant-making agencies, and you want to be sure to pay attention to all of them as potential funding sources for your project. Some of that federal funding, of which there's between $500 and $600 billion in any given year, and in fiscal year 2018, we saw the biggest increase in discretionary funding that we've seen since the Recovery Act, essentially wiping out the sequestration from 2013. So federal funding, by far the largest source of funding in the country. Now, some of that federal funding goes directly to local recipients. We see that with the COPS grants. We see that with the body-worn camera policy and implementation grants, also funded again this year. But some of that funding is also passed through the states, especially as the funding tends to get larger. It tends to be passed through the states to achieve a kind of equitable distribution across the United States government. Once the states get their hands on the funding, it essentially becomes a state grant at that point. So those federal pass-through funds will be mixed in with other state funding opportunities that may come out of state tax rolls, may come out of state bond acts, or from some other source, and essentially become a state grant. The states can control the timing of grants, matching requirements associated with those grants, and even the priorities. If a grant may come down from the federal government with a laundry list of different priorities that it'll fund, states can restrict those priorities to more closely reflect what they perceive to be their own state's objectives. So federal and state funding sometimes work hand in hand, and then sometimes they may be complementary. Law enforcement agencies don't get a lot of the $50 billion in foundation funding that's made available each year, but law enforcement agencies can be collaborators on foundation-funded projects that are applied for by community organizations, that are applied for by school districts and colleges. So while the agency and the municipality itself may not receive a great deal of foundation funding directly, it may participate and benefit from foundation-funded projects that may run across the community. Federal funding may be $500,000, maybe $1 million in a typical grant. State funding is usually around $100,000 to $200,000 just on average. And then foundation funding tends to be quite a bit smaller. $10,000 to $20,000 would be a decent sized foundation grant. $100,000 would be considered a fairly large foundation grant. And that's the landscape of funding that law enforcement agencies are looking at. We start to look for grant opportunities for your projects.